Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Dan Levinson-Wilk. I'm an associate professor of American history here at FIT. I'm rocking some New Balance 574s. Those are the least impressive shoes you're going to see today. We got some more impressive shoes on the feet of our more impressive people. Yunia Kawamura, Ellen Lynch, Greg Woodcock, all faculty here at FIT, and our special guest, Bobbito Garcia. We're going to bring them up in a little while. But before I introduce them, I got to thank some people. I especially want to thank the United College employees of the Fashion Institute of Technology. A lot of students don't know this, but we're unionized here. Faculty and staff are all members of a union. We're pretty proud members of that union, and we're especially proud because they think events like this are valuable enough to help out with. So thank you to the UCE. I'd also like to thank Dean Patrick Knisley, who's in the house. He's the Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, helped us a little bit. I'd also like to thank Dean Troy Richards of the School of Art and Design, who helped us out. And I'd especially like to thank all of you for being here. Today we're going to be talking about sneakerheads, sneaker collecting, especially the early days, maybe with a focus on the issue of diversity in the sneakerhead community. We're hoping that some of you in the audience have some stories for us also. So we're going to have a few presentations, we're going to have a little Q&A up here, but then it's going to be your turn. We have two mics. One of them is right over here. That's for the brave people who want to tell their story or ask their question in the video camera's point of view, line of sight. If you're shy, you can use that one over there. First up is Professor Yunia Kawamura. She's a professor of sociology here at the Fashion Institute of Technology. She's a leading scholar on the sociology of fashion worldwide, the author of many books on the subject, including The Japanese Revolution in Paris Fashion, Fashionology, which I would say is maybe your most famous book, would you say? Doing research in fashion and dress, fashioning Japanese subcultures, and most importantly for our purposes, the 2016 book Sneakers. She also writes a regular column for the Nikkei, the world's largest financial newspaper. She's awesome, and here she is. Come. Next up, we're going to hear from Greg Woodcock. He's an adjunct instructor of accessory design here at FIT. He is also a prolific designer. He's been the lead designer for footwear at P. Diddy's brand Sean John. He's launched the footwear division of the Mossimo brand, and he's designed shoes, luggage, and sports bags for Fila, for Fubu Fat Farm, Diane von Furstenberg, Nautica, Chaps, and the Trump label. So please come on up.
It's good to just show Bobby up there after we talk about the Trump label, right? My name is Greg Woodcock, and I want to say, thank you to Daniel and to Uni for this opportunity, and it's good to be here with my fellow colleagues. Welcome Bobbito to this fantastic event. I want to say that it's pretty awesome to be standing here, not only because we're having this event, but just sheerly from the fact that, look how far sneakers have come. Look how far things can actually go. I come from, what I used to say a lot was, I'm the product of an influential make it or break it shoe critique society. And what that really translates to mean is I'm from New York City, and I was kind of born at this time where, what you had on your feet after you were, pre-adolescent, and after your parents bought you your footwear and your, whether it was church shoes or, that's what you had. You had church shoes or you had sneakers, And, finally, when you're sort of defining what you would wear and your own style and your own, your sense of self, my earliest memory, I think of, this whole advent of going into this was the Pro Kids. And so I asked my father, to buy me a pair of Pro Keds. I wanted the 69 Pro Keds brown. There was a chocolate brown. Like every time I looked across the schoolyard in the Bronx, everybody had the chocolate brown. And my father said, yeah, okay, I'll get them for you. And he brought home a pair of black Pro Keds. And that was like the absolute wrong thing to do at the tender age of whatever, 8, 9 years old. And I cried. And he was like, what are you crying for? And I was like, I wanted the brown, and he was just like, well, now you'll have the black, and I was just like, okay, so I had to, I guess that was my first advent into learning how to, let's say, trend set, because after a while, kids started to pick up on the black and other colors, and, so it happened. But it's so funny to be here again because, sometimes I don't really call myself a sneakerhead or a hype beast or a collector. I see myself as a designer, and that title, goes away like slower and slower every day. When I walk into like a Nike ID and I see people walk with their shoes and they're like, I designed these, and I'm like, did you work for Nike? And they're like, no, I got on Nike ID and I tapped a couple of keys, and so I'm here to sort of say what that's all about and sort of offer my piece to this. So I was interested in something called industrial design. I actually went to the High School of Art and Design, and I wanted to do architecture because I thought that made money and I didn't know what else to do. And I did that. I signed up for it and I got stuck with something called industrial design. And I didn't want to do that, and I didn't know what it was, and people were just making clay pots. That's what I remember, that there were clay pots being made. Like, it felt like home ec, and I was like, what is going on here? And so finally the teacher comes up to me and he says, why aren't you participating? I was, pretty studious as a kid coming up, but, for those 2 weeks, I was just at the back of the classroom. And I said, I was supposed to be in architecture. And he said, well, industrial design is kind of the architecture of things around you. And as soon as he said that, I thought, wow, I have my idea for a chair, and I have my idea for a car, and lighting, and. And so, it's an interesting place where life takes us because, after that, I decided on vehicles, and I wanted to design cars. And I went on to Pratt Institute, and I studied industrial design, and I did transportation design. And we took a road trip to Detroit, as juniors, and we tried to figure out this whole design thing. But as a New Yorker, and I always say this, is anybody out here from Detroit? Oh, David. Never mind. Detroit is very poppin' now, very, very nice, and but Detroit, for me back then, it was very quiet. It was the sticks, Dave, and as a New Yorker, it was kind of like, I don't want to be here, like even though that was my passion, that was my love, from somebody that come from the big city and Motor City wasn't for me. And when I got back, I spoke to my professor and I said, I don't know about car design anymore. He said, really? And a lot of us were kind of talking this way. And he says, if you guys don't design cars, you should do shoes. And so I thought, what? And he says, think about it. The way you render these vehicles, it's still transportation. It's still transporting your body. It's still performance related for the way an athlete needs to move. And I have to say, that one spark like set me off into this design world, and I got my start at Fila, and that was great. And in fact, even just Saturday, I came back from China to do some footwear development for the company I'm with. And I'm happy to be standing here to just tell you all it's a real career. but besides, the hype that comes with it, I was just talking to my cousin this morning. I said, you know something? I'm looking at these kids on the subway and the buses and everything. And I said, it is a wonderful thing to be able to have access to performance footwear. So think about that for a moment. All of the shoes that you're wearing, all of the sneakers, even though they might be considered classics, even though they might be considered a style that is well held, that was your performance footwear from yesteryear, right? And all of this footwear, you could be wearing dress shoes and brogue shoes like we were in the 30s or the 50s or eras of the past, but you have access to performance footwear. So think about that for a minute. I mean, it's like my analogy, I guess, would be like a jet. Like if you want to take a trip, to the West Coast, you might get on a plane, and that's going to be a commercial jet, but there are other types of jets, right? They're like fighter jets that have like all this capability. That's kind of pretty much how I see sneakers. They are athletic footwear, performance gems that we actually have access to. And just think, some of your heroes that wore some of these shoes on the court, on the fields, you have access to them. So it's just been a beautiful walk, to be able to, have that walk of my life into, what we do today and modernly call a footwear designer. And so I just wanted to say, I'm really proud to be amongst the panel with you here today, Bobby, and to, I look at Bobby as like an ambassador, and I was just sharing a story with him before we got on about, what I remember of him and, just, these overlaps of people that have been in what I call an influential make it or break it shoe society, like that kind of critique, that edge, I saw Clark Kent, the other day in a clothing store, and I was able to relate to him and tell him at a Spike Lee party, what he did with a Soul to Soul record, and he broke the record after he played it. It was just pandemonium the way he, held that rhyme. You know what I mean? Like before the song actually, let play, like before he let the beat go. So I'm happy to be able to just like talk about little tidbits of people that, make this whole sneakerhead and community of us that, turn this into something real. It's so, I've worked in high schools also where, I'm able to tell after school programs and tell people's parents, this is actually a real career. Don't, dissuade your child from doing sketches or doodles. I myself have, done doodles in church. I would ask my mom for a pen and paper and just sketch, and that led me to somewhere. So to me, as artists and art children, it's very important to be able to hone those skills and, sort of be proud of where you're from. So. Should I mention the Trump thing or before I go there?
Here is this, yeah, there we are. I'm going to introduce for over here so that they can get a video set up. Bobbito Garcia, AKA Cool Bob Love, first won fame in the 1990s, co-hosting the Stretch Armstrong. You guys can come up while I'm talking, I don't mind. Come on up. Co-hosting the Stretch Armstrong and Bobbito show, where they helped introduce the world to unknown rappers, people you've never heard of, like Jay-Z and Busta Rhymes and the Wu-Tang Clan and the Notorious B.I.G. All got their start in part because they were promoted on this radio show. He then went on to many other things, many other careers. He makes movies. He's been a street ball advocate. He's played in Puerto Rico in the major leagues in basketball there. He's an author about sneakers. He wrote, As Uni Told Us, Where'd You Get Those? New York City Sneaker Culture, 1960 to 1987. He's also a contributor to another book called Out of the Box, The Rise of Sneaker Culture. He was featured in the sneaker documentary Just for Kicks that I bet a lot of people in this room have seen already. He hosted It's the Shoes for ESPN Films, in which he interviewed a whole bunch of celebrities about their sneakers. He's the face of the sneakerhead community. He is a little bit slow getting out the flash drive, so I'm going to stall a little bit. He's awesome. He grew up on the Upper West Side. We were just talking about 96th Street recently and all of the clothing stores that aren't there anymore. Are we ready?
What's up?
All right. Bobbito Garcia.
What happens if I close this?
Don't close it all the way, because then we lose you up.
Got you. Okay, cool. What's up, everybody? Peace. My name is Bobbito Garcia, aka Cool Bob Love. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the illustrious panel. And it's kind of a crazy 24 hours. I was just at Converse yesterday with Clark Kent, speaking about sneakers, and it's it's this constant sort of not dream come true, but sort of unfathomable experience to be upheld as this ambassador and spokesperson for an entire global community, and which I am a product of. And no different than Greg, I sketched as a child. I also started customizing and painting my sneakers as a child. And this is back in the 70s. I'm born in 1966, very proud of that, because I got to experience this sort of burgeoning movement of not only sneakers, but also hip hop and playground basketball, and also New York, and this sort of like these 2 decades, 3 decades, which are entirely different than what exists today in this city. But there's a continuum. So essentially, I took my biggest cue from my brother Ray. He's my oldest, and I looked up to him as a child. And Ray was the type of cat that he calls it. He's a professor now. He calls it a culture of one. Essentially, my brother did not want to trend set. He didn't want to look like anybody else, and he didn't want anyone else to look like him afterwards either. So he would chop off logos with a razor blade from his sneakers so that people could not identify what he had on. He would paint his sneakers so that people would not know what he had on. Just because he wanted to go out, play ball, have good performance sneakers, and literally have the sense that no one else, not just in our community, but in the world, looked like him. Now that was a bit extreme, but it was also beautiful in a way. And I took that sort of creative disposition and kind of just ran with it as a child. Initially, that meant wearing 5 to 6 pairs of socks to wear my brother's shoes that were a full size and a half bigger than mine. Eventually, there were kind of 3 ways in which my generation of children born in the 60s, being raised with basketball in every single facet of our lives all around us, as well as like seeping in this sort of hip hop sensibility that was very different than the generations before us. And so our approach was to, as a statement, we didn't want to look like anybody else. And so what we did was we started painting our sneakers so that we could have a color stripe that no one else had. Because distribution was limited back then. Brands were limited back then. Stores were limited back then. And so, people always ask me, well, what do you think about, sneaker world today? I'm like, this is the greatest era ever, because you can buy a sneaker that's only released in Japan online. You more than likely won't get robbed for your sneakers or beat up for them. That happens still, but for the most part, people have a way about only wearing shoes that they've worn. And so not only did we paint our sneakers, but we also had this idea that happened in the mid-'70s because models were being released and then they weren't available the next year. And it's kind of set a marker in our brains like, well, if we buy a pair of those sneakers and don't wear them for 3 years or 5 years, by then, no one will have them. And that's how the boxing started. Because boxes, we couldn't resell our sneakers back then. That was unheard of. That doesn't start until the 90s. But in the 70s and the early 80s, the box became like this sort of hermetically sealed, not quite, incubator of a shoe that could protect it from dust, from sunlight, from heat, from your radiator. And so that, you know, your midsole hopefully wouldn't yellow. And you can come out 5 to 7 years later, 10 years later, perhaps, and have a new pair of sneakers that absolutely nobody has because they're no longer available. Because the other thing in the 70s and 80s was that there was no such thing as reissues. Brands, as Uni mentioned, had no idea about this entirety of existence for people like myself. There was no dialogue. And that's why, you know, I've done sneaker design collaborations with Nike, Adidas, K1X, Pro-Keds, Puma, Piola. At this point, I'm very proud of that, the diversity that I've been allowed. But again, similar to speaking here and similar to doing collaborations with all these huge brands, that was unfathomable. Because in the 70s and 80s, if I wrote a letter to Nike, there was no way that they were going to respond. However, now, due to social media, the brands not only are very aware of people like myself who are your age and younger, but they also listen. And there's this symbiotic coexistence of communication. Like the brands let you know, like, hey, we're going to drop the sneaker on November 17th. You know, in my era, you went to the sneaker shop all the time because there was no knowledge of when a sneaker was going to drop. There was no knowledge of what sneaker was going to drop. And in the 70s, there might be a new color that came out once a year. Not, you know, color of the month, or, you know, next week we're going to put it out with the, you know, it's just a huge, huge difference. So in any event, that was the existence that I kind of came up with. And I was very passionate about it. I was very passionate about basketball. I was very passionate about performance, and that was my take on it. So I had this like unique approach, but also had this performance approach, and also had this hip hop approach. And in 1990, I had this amazing opportunity. The Source magazine was founded at Harvard as a newsletter for a hip hop radio show out of WHRB. They moved to New York. All their publication did was album reviews, concert reviews, local reports. They had nothing to do with fashion. They had nothing to do with culture. And the editor-in-chief at the time, I was known at that point for painting shoes in the hip-hop world, in the club world, and in the basketball world. He was like, yo, I think you're the perfect dude to write this article. And for some of you who have been solicited to write, usually an editor gives you a range, okay? He gave me absolutely no direction. He said, just write about sneakers. I don't care what you write about, just write something about sneakers. Because I'm not a sneakerhead, and I'm not, he wasn't a great dresser. Just real talk, you know. And so I decided to pen an article titled Confessions of a Sneaker Addict. And it turned out, and I wrote it in 1990, it published in 91. It was the first article in media history to ever speak volumes the way that it did to people who were passionate about sneakers worldwide. After that, I learned that college students had torn the article out and taped it to their wall. There were people who had memorized the article. It received the biggest amount of reader letters for any front of the book article in the publication's history. Afterwards, the Source was able to solicit brands, apparel brands, for advertising, which helped the magazine grow. By the mid-90s, it was the #1 selling music magazine on newsstands in the United States. And that all goes back to this sort of sneaker positioning that was allowed by my words and my thoughts. That opened up a whole door to me consulting Nike in the 90s. By the mid-90s, I opened up the very first sneaker boutique in New York, perhaps in the world. It was called Bobbito's Footwork, whereby I had sneakers on wood shelves and with spotlights, which was unheard of at the time. Moving forward, I was able to host the very first TV series on sneaker culture called It's the Shoes on ESPN. And now I'm speaking at FIT. My book, titled Where'd You Get Those? New York City Sneaker Culture in 2003, was an outgrowth of my experiences with the store, with the sneaker article. It was the first book to approach sneakers from a sociological aspect and allowing not just the industry to speak, but also the people of the community who, as Uni mentioned, were predominantly people of color, not exclusively, but predominantly. And it's this incredible social phenomena whereby, people with no resources basically uplifted and elevated an entire industry that benefited in the 80s by increasing sales 300%. Not many industries can do that in their best dreams. But I was a part of that, and I just became a spokesperson for it, and that's why I'm here now. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there. That's a lot. I'll hang around for questions. Should I moonwalk?
You heard Michael's shoes are up for auction. Did you hear about that? The moonwalk shoes? The moonwalk shoes are up for auction this week, I believe, so that was very appropriate. Why don't you all come up, all of our panelists, and we'll get started. I have one more introduction to make. We're now going to be joined. You can come on up. Oh, and I closed it, didn't I, after I told you not to? Oh, well. Ellen Lynch, who is going to be joining the other speakers, is professor of accessory design here at FIT and a designer at Custom Bridal Millinery in Port Washington. She's the author and co-author of such works as The Accessories Bible, Making Stylish Belts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I got to come sit down with you guys also. Welcome to everybody. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then it's going to be your turn. All right.
1, 2.
It is great to have you all up here. I'm looking at all of you, and Bobbito was just talking about the ethnic diversity, or lack thereof maybe, in the early days. On the stage, I see a Japanese woman, I see a black man, I see a Latino man, I see a couple of Jews who married some Irish Catholics. Can you guys talk a little bit, any of you, about whether it was ethnically diverse back in the early days? If the minority in this case was white and Asian people and what they were doing in the scene, whether they were welcomed, and also in terms of gender, when you met your first female sneakerhead. No one has any thoughts on this? Okay.
I can speak volumes about that. So the sneaker industry was predominantly white, male. I started consulting in 93, 94. And Nike, Adidas, all the brands have made great strides to diversify. They had no choice, because if they were going to understand this cultural movement, they had to put people in place from the neighborhoods that were helping them sell as many sneakers as they were. I was at New Balance at one point, and the shoes that you have on, the 576 or 574. 75% of all 574s in the entire world are sold in New York. 75%. Well, this is like about 10 years ago when I had a meeting there. So that just gives you an idea about how powerful this city is when it comes to the industry, also the culture and the movement. Now, as the industry has diversified, I will make note that while I will sing volumes about the contribution of people of color in the 70s, there needs something to be said about the original resellers were Japan and Europe. And in the early 90s, when the sort of dead stock, what people call now dead stock, shoes sort of dried up, there were buyers who were sent to the United States to comb the Midwest, to comb the South, to comb the Northwest. You know, the cities that weren't New York and Detroit and Chicago that were heavy with sneakers, but the Des Moines and the Tallahassees. And it wasn't until I opened up my store in '96, Footwork, you know, I literally my eyes would light up if a Japanese buyer walked in with a duffel bag, because I knew I was about to pay my rent in the next 15 minutes. Now, I was buying my sneakers from various sources for $10 to $15, you know, and marking them up to $25, $30. I thought, wow, I'm making 100% profit. This is amazing. They were buying my shoes for $30, not asking for a discount. This is great. Until I went to Japan and saw the same sneakers being sold for $250 to $300. And I was like, whoa, whoa. But the Japanese and the Europeans had a value about shoes that were no longer available that, not in the US, it took a while for the brands as well as the consumers to catch up. And that's why you see, you know, if you ride the train like we do, you know, you'll see Jordan 1s, you'll see Jordan 11s, you'll see the foam posits, all shoes that came out 20, 25 years ago. And that's a layer that most people don't realize that was a huge contribution to the overall industry and culture.
Any other thoughts on that question before I move on to the next one?
About gender, maybe?
Sure.
I mean, I met only a couple female sneakerheads during my research, but I can share an anecdote about myself being an Asian woman as a researcher who's trying to conduct research on sneakers. It wasn't easy. Like, if I go to the convention, I was practically like the only Asian, you know, tiny woman, you know, trying to, you know, do research at the site. And also, if I ask a kid, oh, okay, you have great sneakers, you know, what is that? So I wanted to actually know the model of the sneakers, and the kid would say, this is Nike. As if I don't know Nike. As if I don't know, like, the basic, like, you know, brands, and as if I could recognize, like, Swish on the sneakers. So, you know, talk about, like, insider, outsider. As a woman, I do feel like the outsider when I was doing my research, you know. I don't know if you could help me, you know, in that.
Sure, Uni, I will. It's very true. Most females are not really considered sneaker enthusiasts or sneakerheads. We're considered more knowledgeable in the area of sneakers. We kind of like the sneakers because they're pretty. We kind of tend to gravitate towards color or towards style. But there's a fabulous book that was released, I think a year and a half ago, Girls Got Kicks. Yeah. And it really tells the story of a lot of girls who were very frustrated because it was a man's area and they wanted to break into it. Largely, it was people who were skateboarders and who loved the look, loved the sport, loved being able to do the acrobatics, and wanted some flash in their shoes, and they couldn't find it. So that's your female sneakerhead.
Interesting enough, Laurie Lobenstein, who authored Girls Got Kicks, she also went to Wesleyan, my alma mater, and she started a website called Female Sneaker Fiends, I believe. .com some years ago, and she reached out to me when Where'd You Get Those came out, my book, in 2003, to introduce herself as a proud fellow alum, but also to question why I had no prominent women in my book. I had 25, 30 interviewees. One was a woman.
Thank you.
But I responded in that I don't doubt that there were women who were intense about sneakers in the 70s and 80s. I just didn't know them. And so I could only interview people who I was familiar with and was knowledgeable that they were on the same level of expertise as I was. And it's something that really struck me when she asked me, because I sort of sought women to interview, but I didn't go extra hard looking for it. The men that I knew to interview were layups, because they all play ball with me, or they all were prominent hip hop artists and stuff. So I'm really glad that Lori has opened up that curtain to women, and they're absolutely a part of this. Rihanna's done some collabs with Puma recently that are selling extremely well, and clearly women are a factor in this. In fact, historically, Nike was #1 in the late 70s and early 80s, and Reebok shook them for about 2 years because Nike was approached about this new aerobics craze that was led by women, and they were like, we're not interested, whatever. And Reebok was like, well, we'll make an aerobics shoe, and that's how Reebok really became a force in sneaker sales. Nike after that kind of was like, all right, well, we're not going to let that happen again. So anyway.
I want to say also, Bobby brought up the 5411s.
Please call me Bob or Bobbito.
Bobbito.
Yeah. Oh, you can call me Bob. Bobby is like my 5th grade teacher.
Now,
you make
Bobby.
me feel really young if you call me Bobby.
Excuse me. Bobbito.
Can I call you Greggy?
You can.
Yeah.
But we'll stick to Greg. So I wanted to bring up the 5411s, a.k.a. the Reeboks aerobic shoe, and they were nicknamed the 5411s just based on the price. Just even culturally, again, if it has a price tag of $49.99 with tax, at that time it would be 5411. They get the nickname 5411. So just to give you a backdrop culturally, by the time I was working as a designer at Fila, one of the salesmen told me that when he worked at Reebok, they had something at that time called apartheid in South Africa, which is the legal separation of blacks and white people, in the country. And it was a big thing here, and that was starting to sort of catch fire, socially, culturally. And a rumor went around. It was just a rumor that Reebok was the biggest supporter of apartheid, and their sales dropped. And as a salesperson, my buddy told me, he said, you have no idea. You would walk into a shop in New York City, and how much the kids in the stores were even conscious and buzzing about that, and it affected their sales. So we definitely have dollar power, obviously. It's not just, large sneaker companies looking to see how we move, jump, and play and act, but just the fact of holding back something from a notion that you hear, or some sort of fake news or half-truth, that goes on. It can have a tremendous effect, on the culture.
Greg, I want to stay with it for a second, because I think it relates to something we were talking about earlier before we came on about New Balance. That right after the Trump election, the CEO of New Balance said, this is great because it means we're going to bring some manufacturing back to America, which New Balance, more than any other sneaker company, I think has really been at the forefront of manufacturing here. But when they said something pro-Trump, their consumers flipped out, and people started bonfires all over the country of New Balance in protest. So as someone who's maybe worn a New Balance in the past. I don't know if you have, but also worked a little bit for the brand. What did you think about that when it happened?
Well, I would say, when that happened, I heard it more as negative press because the support of the Trump organization, was from, certain powers that be in the corporation of New Balance, and that had more of a negative play in and of itself. But I would say that a lot of footwear organizations are definitely in love with the idea of taking, some of the development onshore. So, by the one hand, I don't fault them on having that kind of ideology to want to do that, but as far as like the news and the wildfire goes, the decisions that you make or, the factions that you stick with, might have a repercussion on your organization. So there's no real telling, but, as far as the consumer is concerned, once you hear something like that, it can have an amazing effect, either negatively or in certain cases, positive.
But Dan, isn't that really the case with almost everything that happens in the world? For example, if there's some sort of issue about race or gender, and there's an Olympic year, that's going to have effect on the Olympics. It's also going to have effect on the sneakers that those athletes are wearing. So either the consumer is going to want to purchase them or they're not going to want to purchase them. And the same thing holds true with what's happening right now.
I mean, it reminds me also of a lot of flack that Nike, more than any other company, I think, has gotten for its overseas labor conditions. I'm not sure why Nike has been targeted more than other companies that also offshore their production. But if you guys, maybe I'm right or not, I don't know, but I feel like they happen.
Yeah, back to New Balance, little tidbit, I can't 100% confirm, although their ethos is to manufacture in the U.S., a lot of their products that they put the shoe together, the smaller parts are not manufactured in the U.S., so it's not 100% U.S. Yeah. They don't share that, but behind the scenes, I had the interesting position of being a Wesleyan grad, being liberal, having my hands in supporting activism through the radio show that I did in the 90s, and then coming to the point of 94, 95, doing consulting with Nike, doing events at a moment when they were being exposed for having businesses, subcontracting with sweatshops in Asia. And I had to really think hard and long about my relationship with them at the time and Nike has done a great job of rebounding from that. And a childhood friend of mine started working for Nike. And I asked him, I was like, what's the deal? And he said, yo, Bob, I have been to Asia. And, we have deaded subcontracts with the sweatshops, have improved our contracts with plants that are, taking care of their employees and da-da-da-da. And I had to trust that. And Nike did a great job as well of sort of reversing that bad publicity in their favor. But, still, they didn't have anyone on their board who was a person of color for many, even though Jordan was head of a whole sub-brand. But, they've made their strides and they got there. And at the time, I had to position it like, well, Nike is hiring me. Nike is creating events in my neighborhood throughout the 5 boroughs. No other brand cares about anything that's happening in these neighborhoods. Do I step back or do I continue to support them and hope that they will come around to the positive element that they wound up doing so? And it worked out. In 2018, I would highly doubt that Nike at this point has their hands in sweatshops. Can they? Who knows? But with the social responsibility and the transparency that came forward during President Obama's era, I'd like to think that there's a lot of companies that think about being green. And, Nike has a regrind program where they take old shoes and they build courts with the outsoles and stuff. So there's a lot of give back that they've created. That's very positive.
All right, I got one more question for all of you before we throw it out to the audience. First is sort of a two-part question. Greg's already answered the first pair of shoes story, first pair of sneakers, more or less. But I also want to know about wearing sneakers to work. We actually have a vice president of academic affairs here, Jack Oliva, who I think proudly wears sneakers. So I feel like we're moving in a good direction there. But I wear sneakers usually to work. But this is something that's not always been acceptable, and I feel like maybe the sneakerhead community has really pushed that. So, Ellen, it looks like you want to go first.
Sure, I'll start. I'm the old person here on the panel. When I was growing up, like Greg, we had two pairs of shoes, and one of them being sneakers. But you couldn't wear sneakers to school. You only kept your sneakers in your locker for gym day. You were never allowed to wear sneakers to any of your houses of worship. You were never allowed to wear sneakers to any major event. You could wear sneakers to the movies, and that was fine because it was dark. And my sneaker of choice was Keds, not because I wanted it, but that was my requirement. I could wear a pair of white Keds. And just to put it into a little bit more perspective for you, when I joined the workforce, it was not until 4 years later, 1972, that I was actually allowed to wear pants to work. I never wore pants to school. I was not allowed to. Not underpants, long pants. But in my closet, I had all different colors of Keds. I had Vans, I had Converse, and as soon as I started here at FIT, I was able to take all of them out, and my shoe of choice is still the Converse. I love them. I have them in every single color. Most of them are the slip-ons because they're easy to wear, but growing up, they were just for sport. That was it.
Yeah. As I said, I only had two pairs of sneakers when I started my research about sneakers, but now I'm so fascinated with them. I have about a dozen, but the first sneaker that I bought is actually Converse. Yeah, I do like a Chuck Taylor Converse. I don't know why. They're just so appealing to me, and they come in different designs and colors. And this one I found last week online, and this is, I'm so proud about this sneaker. This is Andy Warhol collection. This is Campbell soup, bean soup design. I usually don't wear sneakers to work. One reason is because I tend to wear a skirt, and I'm right now trying to find, investigate ways to wear sneakers in an elegant way so that I can wear them with my long skirts. So I'm still trying to navigate that area.
Leggings.
Okay.
All right. Anybody up here in the audience want to ask anything? Come on down to one of these mics. That's the one you'll be seen at. This is the one you won't be seen at. If you guys are all really shy, I'll keep pitching questions, but we want to hear from you. Come on down. If you want to go ahead. All right.
What's up?
Welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
I think it's still morning.
No doubt, no doubt. We're in the AM. I'm a designer. I do my best to study the history of whatever I partake in. I've been studying sneaker culture for many years as a participant. And most of us are actually familiar with T-shirts, very simple billion-dollar industry. My question is, Bobbito was speaking earlier on the accessories, the building of the sneakers. A sneaker might cost $1 to manufacture, but what is the whole process? The sneaker sole, I mean, how much is gone into the building of a sneaker?
I think everybody's looking at me. So it's a great question. How much money or how much of a process is being put into a sneaker? So I would say the short answer is it depends on the standpoint of sales, and it usually starts with a structure of sales and what a company wants to project for a certain product, and sort of like the dollars and cents come from there, as far as like how they build the product, or is it a marquee product, is it going to be an athlete endorsed product. Those are all happening, especially for like the high-end shoes. Like you think about, let's say a LeBron James shoe that's could go up to $245, retail, and you're looking at this shoe and it's all knit on the upper, and a couple of pieces of leather, or even polyurethane pieces, but it's got this amazing sole unit, and there's maybe some air or some components built into it. So it is true, the raw materials for all of these things have a cheaper cost, and the first cost that the factory, after building such a shoe, pays a certain amount to a factory, so that their sort of economy is helped, and their company's health is helped along with yours. But on our shores, that could be sort of marked up, into things built into margin and so forth for sales. But yeah, like a shoe like that could cost up to, between $12 and $18 to make. Just true and tried, like raw materials. You're talking about lots of polymers and TPRs and rubbers and all these fancy terms for raw materials that are just mixed with components to give you a basic new product. All of these shoe companies are proprietary to their brand. I always say in class, like each company has almost like their witch's cauldron that they're mixing up of components. It's not just the spongy component. Now it seems like everybody's familiar with EVA now, which is basically the foam component or the spongier component of a midsole in a shoe. Stands for ethyl vinyl acetate, which is just a fancy name for that. Yeah. So, those are the things that, really equal out to be compounds. And again, they're just raw materials that have a cheaper cost. Also, those costs are what they call like the amortization process. Basically, if you have a style, let's say like the Air Max 95, and I said 95, so that style like that's been running since 1995, and it keeps resurging. A shoe like that is on the shelf for about $145, right, Jonathan? Right? 145. I haven't bought them in a while, but so I feel like, yeah, a shoe like that's about $150. Like, they've made their money on the mold. So what everybody doesn't realize also is that the mold fees cost the most. So like you're talking about a CNC machine, a milling machine that's milling out all of these little details and nooks and crannies on a shoe to get the right traction motif and so on and so forth. So after that, exponentially, if I do the first one, that's like $3,000. If I do a size run, that's like $30,000 or $50,000. So this is a tremendous amount of responsibilities. If a footwear company has, let's say, 4 seasons a year, and you have like maybe 25 outsoles that you're opening, you could imagine the cost of some of that. But at the same time, they're very, very healthy companies, so those costs are sort of absorbed by the sales that they make.
So adding to what Greg said, so the most expensive part is going to be the outsole and the midsole. Midsole meaning where all your technology is. And then, of course, if you're doing a knitted upper or you're experimenting with a different type of material in construction, that's going to add to the overall cost. The more that shoe is produced, the more it's sold, the more customers that buy that shoe, the less expensive it becomes for the company. Plus, you have to add to the overall cost the overhead for the company. So how much money are they paying in rent? How much money are they paying for their electric and their gas?
CEO compensation.
Correct. So all of those things get added into the overall price, and then you also need to think about your salesperson, because the salesperson gets 20% on everything that is sold and shipped, not just sold. So all of those factors play into the overall cost of the product.
Yeah, it's funny when Greg was talking about this, it makes me think, you transferred from cars to shoes, but you're just in a different transportation technology industry now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also realize that most brands have a whole research and development team. That's salaries, that's cost to research, go out in the fields, focus groups. They hire ad agencies, they hire creative agencies, and also realize that if a shoe is $150 from a retail aspect, the consumer's buying it for $150, but Etonic is selling it to the shoe store for $75 or $80. So you're thinking like, damn, this shoe only costs $5 to make. I'm paying $150, but Etonic or whatever, they're only making $75 on it. So, the shoe store's got to make a little cut.
All right, please come up. Thank you.
We need women to be represented on this
Yes,
mic,
yes,
right?
yes.
This can't be a male-dominated Q&A.
First, I want to thank you for paving the way for young sneakerheads like me. I watched It's the Shoes when I was in like the 3rd grade or something like that.
Way to make me feel old.
I know. I played NBA Street Volume 2, hosted by you at Rutgers Park. I grew up watching you, and I want to thank you for that. My question for you is, what's a memorable moment for you for It's the Shoes? What's your top moment in that TV show?
Absolutely. So, for those who don't know, ESPN had a series called It's the Shoes. I was the host as well as creative producer. I got that position because of what I wrote and Where'd You Get Those? I was very happy to do that. At the onset of the show, and this is all detailed in my upcoming film, it's titled Rock Rubber 45. So it's an autobiographical documentary. The New York premiere will be at Central Park Summer Stage on June 25th. I hope that each of you will be there because it shows a lot of detail and background into all this sneaker stuff that I've been able to benefit off of. But essentially, when we had our first meeting, when they brought me on board, I was like, you know what? We're going to go into these millionaires' homes, and it's going to just feel like lifestyles of the rich and famous. Of course, they can have 200 shoes. The brands give them to them for free. They're endorsed athletes or endorsed entertainers. And I challenged them. I said, we have to have some type of community give back. And so we thought as a team, well, why don't we get the personalities to sign a shoe for each time that we interview, whether it was Michael Vick or Baron Davis or Kobe Bryant or Nelly or whoever it was in the first season, Fat Joe, Clark Kent, and so I had been advocating a nonprofit called Hoops for Hope back dating to 2003. They are based in Zimbabwe and South Africa, And what they do is they take donations of basketballs, sneakers, and basketball uniforms and use them as a draw to kids in those areas to come to not only learn about basketball, but also life skills and HIV prevention. Incredible program. And so I designated Hoops for Hope as the recipient of these signed player exclusives and celebrity exclusives. And they raised thousands of dollars. That's only part of it. What we did, we sent cameras to the auction and made it a segment in the last show of the season. After that, Hoops for Hope was getting hit up from all across the country. Yo, we want to do a donation drive. We want to support what you're doing. We want to go down to South Africa and Zimbabwe and support you. Be there. And so Hoops for Hope was just overwhelmed by the reception that I helped usher. And about 2 years later, they actually erected a court and dedicated it in my name. So I have a court named after me in Africa. It's crazy. And it's a highlight of my upcoming film and a highlight of my whole sneaker experience as well. So that's the answer.
Come on up.
Hi. So my question is, what was it like when the first retros came out in the 90s? Like, what was people's reactions to that? Like, did it sell out? Were they reselling, or they still weren't getting as much love?
I guess that's coming to me. Well, the first retros weren't actually in the 90s. The 90s is when the retro reissue really became a category for most brands. But that starts back in 1986, 87 with the Nike Air Force One. And there's a great film, a documentary, directed by the same team that did Just for Kicks, which I hope that each of you here has watched or will. But it's called Air Force One, Anatomy of an Urban Legend. I don't think it ever got released, or it may have gotten released finally last year. You can research it, but it has a phenomenal history. And we were all blown away because, the Air Force One, similar to the Adidas Americana in '75, was one of those shoes that we were like, hey, buy it now because it's not going to be there next year. And so we would just go to Virginia, we go to wherever we could to find the Air Force One and hope that, maybe it was on sale, because stores didn't know that shoes that were out of stock would have value back then. So they would just put them on a table for sale for like $20, $25. But when Nike got word from a Baltimore retailer that kids were coming in requesting vehemently, intensely, like, please bring back the Air Force One, and Nike listened. And they were the first brand to have that relationship with the street. And they brought back the Air Force One, and it was insanity. It was insanity. There was one store in New York that carried them in the Bronx, near Simpson Street, which was a dangerous neighborhood, which was similar to Delancey Street, where there were stick-up kids waiting on Friday because there were no credit cards. We didn't go to college. We weren't offered debit cards. Debit cards didn't exist. People went to sneaker stores with cash. And so you would get stuck for your cash before you got to the sneaker store, or you would come out to the sneaker store and get stuck for your sneakers. Stuck, AKA burped, AKA robbed. It was an unfortunate experience. It was also exhilarating, because if you made it back to the train, you're like, holy shit, and so the sneakers became a badge of honor, because not only was it not public knowledge, speaking to Uni's investigation, this subculture, not only did you have to know where the store was, but you had to make it back. So if you did both of those things, it was like, that's the name of my book. Where'd you get those? Because you came back downtown, and we were like, yo, where'd you get those? Nah, I can't tell you, Sorry. So that was the experience. You know, it was this sort of like, man, we thought this would never happen, and it did. And the reaction and the sales were so strong that it sent a bat signal to the rest of the industry, and they were like, oh man, we gotta start putting sneakers back out.
I mean, yeah, I totally can relate to that. Like Simpson Street, you know, I mean, I remember the first time I basically, you know, sort of went to buy my own pair of sneakers, you know, like being like 14, 15 years old. I got some summer job money in my pocket and going down to Southern Boulevard area and going to a sneaker store called Jew Man at the time. And, you know, Jew Man was, you know, just, you know, I remember there were just like folded up clothes everywhere, you know, and just like no kind of facade. Like, you know, you see a sneaker shop today and it's just like wood floors and, you know, totally different. Like, I mean, this was just like...
The actual name of the store was Rosie's Dry Goods.
Exactly, Rose Dry Goods. Yeah, it said that out there, and I was always baffled by that. Like, what does that mean? But anyway, you know, I need those Air Max 1s, you know? And I remember going, like, maybe a few doors down, and they were like $90. Whew, like, I don't have that. And I would go into Jew Man, and it was just like $75 a watch. They don't have my size. This is great, you know? So, hey, let me get those in a 12. Well, I was wearing 12, and we're 13 now. So I remember, hang on a minute, and they would make a phone call, and then somebody would come in with the kicks, and I was thinking to myself, like, did somebody just get robbed for my kids? And that wasn't the case. They had like a warehouse maybe down the block in the cut somewhere, but that type of operation was just so odd. And so I remember getting home with them like, whew, I made it home, you know, like, wow, like you're able to open this up in the box, in the bag, and have a look at them like parked in your house, like, wow, they're home, you know, like I didn't get questioned or, you know, robbed or dealt with, you know, so I could definitely understand that.
So we are technically at the end, but we got to have our one last question. So come on up.
Yay!
Okay, it's not in depth. If you guys could only wear one pair of sneakers for the rest of your life, which pair would you wear?
New Balance 574.
Well, that's obvious, Professor.
Oh, which one would you?
Me?
Come back up to the mic. We need to hear it.
Well, I came here as an extra credit thing from my professor, but I'm super fascinated by this. If I could only wear one pair, I'd probably wear Supergas, because I just think they're cool, because of the color options. But
What's it called?
Supergas. They're like Italian. It's very trendy, but they have magenta, and I love magenta, so.
I'd wear Chuck Taylors.
Oh, okay.
Any kind.
Uni?
Converse Highness, if you know what that is, because there's a bit of wedge. Yeah, and since I'm not that tall, you know, I like that wedge. I know you don't like it, Dan. You think wedges are very ugly. I remember you saying that. But for short people, these wedges are actually very helpful.
Every little bit counts.
Yeah, so Converse Highness, my favorite, actually.
Greg?
Oh, no. I really don't know. I mean, the Vans? Yeah. I really don't know. That's a really tough one for me. I mean, I would want to take it classic if you talk about the rest of my life. I don't know. I think I could deal with a pair of like Puma Clydes, high tops or something like that. I mean, that would be something that would kind of be a mark on, you know, who I was growing up, and maybe I would want to have that next to me for the rest of my life. But any of a situation like that, a Pro Ked or a Puma Clyde or something like that.
Dan, I just want to add, if you are a designer, you can't ask that question.
I know, that's why I asked it.
Absolutely can't
I'm
ask
in
that
design
question.
school, so I just like to, you know.
Okay, that's
Mess
fair.
with people. We
Yeah.
understand.
That is
Any
uncomfortable.
last thought on that, Bobbito? No, he doesn't want to answer that question either. Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the panelists. See you at Summer Stage.